So then when Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson became president. But Johnson, as I mentioned, was out of step with the Congress, the Republicans in Congress. He favored Lincoln's lenient plan, but opposes the extension of political rights to former slaves, which means that he was in favor of the 13th, but not the 14th Amendment, right? And then he said that if the South ratified the 13th Amendment, repudiated Confederate debt, they could be all the rights and property would be restored. And so by the end of 1865, all but one of the states had been restored to the Union. Okay, you guys are with me? Questions, comments about this? Now, remember that Lincoln's second election occurred in 1864, and that means in 1866, there were what we call midterm elections. What are midterm elections? Who gets elected in midterm elections?
Representatives.
Representatives, Congress. And there's a number of other people too, but what about the president? No, you don't vote for president. Right, you don't vote for president in the midterms, okay? That's why they call them midterms, because it's mid-presidential term, okay? Midterm elections. So all of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate gets reelected every 2 years, okay? You guys are following me here? All right, so in 1866, the Republicans won a veto-proof majority in Congress. What is a veto-proof majority? Think about this. First off, what is a veto?
When they reject a decision or proposal made by Congress.
All right, so Congress passes a law, but it doesn't become law until the president signs it. And if the president is against it, then he will veto it. Okay. Now, once the president has vetoed a bill, then what happens to it? Is it dead?
Can't they do a majority vote to overturn the veto?
Exactly. You need a 2/3 majority vote in Congress to overturn the veto, right? So the idea then is that the Congress passes a law, the president vetoes it, but if Congress can muster a 2/3 majority, it still becomes law anyway, right? And so a veto-proof majority would be how many? For the Congress to be able to pass laws that the president couldn't veto, how big of a majority would that be?
It's still 2/3, isn't it?
Right, exactly. So if the Congress, I mean, we have a veto-proof majority now in California, right? Where the Democrats control so much of the assembly and the state Senate that if the governor decided to veto a law, they could override it easily, right? You see what I'm saying? And the same thing is what happened in the United States in 1866. Republicans gained enough of a majority in Congress that no matter what Johnson said, whatever they passed would become law. All right? You guys get what I'm saying? Okay, well, that's important because Johnson didn't agree with Congress on many things, right? Particularly on the idea of Reconstruction. So what happens then is that Johnson, when he becomes president, wants to appoint his own cabinet, okay? And when I say cabinet, I don't mean where he keeps the liquor, right? I'm talking about the people that serve him, okay? Like the Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Secretary of Treasury, those people are his cabinet. And you guys will recall that the way that somebody becomes a cabinet member, we've actually just seen it this year, right? The way that somebody becomes a cabinet member is that the president nominates them for the position and then the Senate approves them or not, right? And so what happened was that Johnson decided to appoint a new cabinet after Lincoln was assassinated, but the Republicans didn't want him to have a new cabinet because the cabinet that Lincoln had was on their side. They were radical Republicans, and Johnson wanted to replace them. You guys follow me here? All right. So what ends up happening then is that the Congress will pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act essentially says that the president can't change his cabinet members without the approval of Congress, right? Well, that's kind of true anyway, but what happens is that Johnson ignores that and he replaces the Secretary of War with Ulysses Grant. And then that will trigger an impeachment. Okay. So now we've seen this actually twice in the last 2 years. So we should understand what impeachment looks like. But let's just go ahead and walk through it. How does impeachment work? If you say the president is impeached, what does that mean?
That Congress has tried to vote the official out.
Okay, so now that's kind of a misunderstanding that Americans have. When we say impeachment, we think that means removal. But removal can be a consequence of impeachment. But impeachment doesn't automatically lead to removal. All right. So that means then impeachment must be something other than removal. What is impeachment?
There's charges against the elected official?
Exactly, charges. So for example, this year when Trump was impeached for the second time, the charges against him was that he instigated a riot at the Capitol, right? Okay, now obviously we're not going to litigate that here in this class, but what we will say is that he was accused of that, and the House of Representatives, by majority vote, made that accusation. Okay, so that means he was impeached. But what happens after the president then is impeached? Who decides whether or not the president actually did what he was accused of doing?
The Senate?
Exactly, the Senate. So impeachment is done by the House. The House of Representatives will accuse the president of committing high crimes and misdemeanors, and then the Senate tries the president, and the outcome of that trial will either be acquittal or removal from office. Okay, you guys get what I'm saying here? Questions, comments about that?
Is it like in like if you get suspended or expelled in school, like the people will decide that, like what happens?
Well, if you get suspended or expelled from school, you can get back into school. But if you get removed from office, you cannot go back into office. You cannot even run for office again. Does that answer your question?
Well, I thought expelled meant like you can't come back, but
Right,
suspended means
you
you can come back.
Right, exactly. But you can't suspend the president, but you can actually expel him from office. That's the same thing as removal from office. That
But
make
you
sense?
just said no, because you said impeached isn't removal.
Right. It doesn't necessarily mean, keep in mind, impeachment is an accusation that's made by the House. And then removal, what happens with that accusation is the Senate tries it. Okay. So let's say that I committed a misdemeanor. I stole a candy bar, right? And somebody caught me. So I go to court and I've been accused of stealing a candy bar, right? It's going to be the court that decides whether or not I actually did steal the candy bar. You see what I'm saying? So that's the
Yeah, that
difference.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the charge of stealing the candy bar is impeachment. And then what happens with that impeachment, it goes to court and court decides whether or not I'm guilty or innocent. In this case, I was guilty, but hey, because I said I stole it, right? You guys are with me, but they didn't read me my rights. So anyway, Does that make sense then? You see how that works?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, so the one difference that we got to keep in mind is that impeachment is a political process. It's not a judicial process. So the same rules that apply to a court don't apply to the Senate. Okay, they get to decide not based on the law, but based on their own decision, what's legal and what isn't legal. All right, you guys are with me? Questions, comments about that? All right. Well, anyway, so Johnson's impeached. He's not removed from office. He the impeachment the impeachment fails by one vote in the Senate, and then but because of the fact that he had been impeached and because of the fact that um, that there was a veto-proof majority in Congress, then what that means is that Johnson essentially became ineffective as president, and the country was essentially ruled directly from the Congress.